We don't believe the church should be sacrificed as some sort of PR offering.
What they were doing is they were giving a sick patient, the economy, tough medicine.
I promise you, I'm one of the few sane ones here in North America.
Hello and welcome to the Aussie Wire News and our first new episode for 2024. We start the year with a big international focus because in this episode we're discussing Ukraine and Volodymyr Zelensky's violent repression of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which one must start to wonder whether Australia really should have sent money and vehicles to prop up a man who, with each passing day, is starting to look more and more like the person we thought he was at war with. Then we're going to make a return to Argentina to discuss some of the frankly remarkable reforms that newly inaugurated President Javier Milei is pursuing. And then we're excited to be introducing our new North American correspondent, Julie Hartman, who's joining the Aussie Wire team to help us stay up to date with all the craziness going on in the US right now, not least of which will be the absolute clown show that the US 2024 presidential election is guaranteed to be. All that and more is coming up right now, but first, I want to take this opportunity to try something that I've wanted to do for a while, and I'll personally be reading all of your comments and feedback to see if this is something that you'd like me to continue doing in future. For a very long time, I've wanted to do a regular show or segment where I take an article from the mainstream media and I break it down, pointing out the unspoken assumptions, the misdirections, the false dichotomies, and sometimes just outright bad journalism. I can't single-handedly fix the appalling quality of so-called journalism in this country, but I can help to educate readers and viewers to see through the common mistakes and tricks so that hopefully in time the quality of journalism in this country improves thanks to the quality of the critical thinking on the part of the consumers. So, I'm testing my theory today with an article from the Sydney Morning Herald by Simon Johansson titled "Rooftop Solar Drives Out Wind, Coal and Grid-Scale Solar." And I'm going to ask and answer the question, how can power prices at a wholesale level be negative 25% of the time, and yet at a retail level we're paying more than ever before? As we'll see in this article, Simon overall does a pretty good job of detailing the problem and offers decent balance on a few key points, but drops the ball on the single most important point, that of what to do about this particular problem. And this is a common theme in modern journalism, correctly identifying the problem and then immediately prescribing a solution that will only make things worse. It's no coincidence that that's a key problem with modern journalism at the same time as with modern politics. But before we dive in, I need to preface this with one important foundational fact. The electricity grid must be kept in balance at all times. That is, the amount of energy being supplied into the system must be balanced against the amount of energy being consumed in the system. And if it gets imbalanced, then brownouts, blackouts, and equipment damage can occur. So, with that foundational piece of information in mind, let's dive in. Simon Johansson published in The Age on January 7th, 2024. Australia's 3.5 million rooftop solar installations are pumping out so much energy on sunny days that they're sending wholesale electricity prices into negative territory, forcing large-scale wind and solar farms as well as coal plants to reduce generation. Over the past 30 days, rooftops contributed 14.6% to the grid. Bundled together with other renewables such as solar farms, wind and hydro, they generated 42% of the country's energy over the same period, according to opennem.org.au. End quote. Now that sounds like a big win, 42% for the entire month from renewables. Well, maybe net zero is not such an unachievable pipe dream after all, right? But those who understand how a grid operates can already see the problem, and it really begins to show itself in the next few paragraphs. Quote, in South Australia's electricity market last year, 24% of all 5-minute spot price trading intervals had negative prices. End quote. In other words, pretty much a quarter of the time in South Australia, the wholesalers were charged money for generating electricity instead of being paid for it. Or to put it another way, at least at the wholesale level, consumers of energy were the ones being paid and not the producers. And that is a really big problem. Let's continue. On the last day of the year in Victoria, electricity spot prices between 6:20am and 5:35pm were less than minus $50 per megawatt hour. Wind and grid-scale solar scaled back in response. Negative. It's just one of many typical days, Mountain said, adding in a blog post, rooftop solar is king, but it is subjugating not just coal, but also wind and solar. Big power generators are frequently shutting off supply on clear sunny days as unrestrained output from household solar panels forces wholesale prices down to zero or below. End quote. How can that be? How can prices be negative? Well, it all comes back to that balance problem for the grid. If it gets unbalanced, then bad things happen. So if the sun comes out from behind a cloud and heaps of domestic rooftop solar installations start pumping energy into the grid, within a matter of seconds, an imbalance can be created. And if that imbalance gets bad enough, bad things happen. So what do they do about it? Well, they can't disconnect the domestic rooftop solar. Those systems aren't designed that way. So instead what they do is they drop the price into negative territory. That is to say, they charge energy producers money for producing electricity, so that all of those producers who can disconnect do. Coal-fired power plants go down to idle. Industrial-scale wind and solar disconnect because they can, and they hopefully bring everything back into balance. But the fact that 24% of the time in South Australia they had negative power prices tells you something. It tells you that they're struggling to keep balance in the system during the middle of the day when the sun is shining. Okay, so we all understand that problem now, but how is that a bad thing? Isn't this just the free energy from the sun that the renewables revolution always promised? Let's keep reading. What we are seeing now in South Australia and Victoria and elsewhere is rooftop solar becoming the dominant energy source during the middle of the day and having quite a big effect, driving off production not just from coal, but also large-scale wind and solar. Grid-scale wind and solar comes back online once demand and prices recover, but coal generators must maintain a minimum operating level and cannot as effectively wind back their exposure to negative prices, bringing forward plans for their early closure as they become less financially viable. End quote. Now, up until this point, the author Simon Johansson has done a pretty good job, in my opinion, of largely just describing the reality of the problem as it exists today. But unfortunately, this article is about to go very, very wrong. The quote continues. Deeply negative prices for long periods of time are not sustainable. That's obviously true. Only a huge expansion of storage will change the market's dynamics. Now, end quote. To be fair to Simon, the author of the article, in this particular bit, he is just quoting the director of the Victorian Energy Policy Centre, Bruce Mountain. That's a position and organisation that sounds a lot more impressive than it is, but we'll get back to that later. What Simon, as the author, what he failed to do in writing this article was to question or offer any sort of perspective on the massive, unspoken assumption contained in this quote from Bruce Mountain. I'll read it again. Only a huge expansion of storage will change the market's dynamics, he, that being Bruce Mountain, said. And there it is. The solution, indeed the only solution, is to double down on the very thing that created the problem in the first place, and that's according to Bruce from the Victorian Energy Policy Centre. Sounds impressive. Who are the Victorian Energy Policy Centre? Well, like most such outfits, their name, whilst technically not a lie, is very much designed to make them sound far more important and official than they actually are. To the casual observer, they might make the mistake of thinking that this is actually a Victorian government body. But at least they do tell you the truth on their website. They are a part of Victoria University's Institute for Sustainable Universities and Livable Spaces, Communities, or the ISILC. So Bruce is the director of a policy centre inside an institute, which is inside a university, which receives enormous amounts of government money and has a vested financial interest in supporting the government's position on climate change and net zero. Now, I'm not suggesting, not even for a moment, that Bruce or anyone else at the VU or the ISILC or the VUPC would have changed their position on climate change or on net zero in order to exploit the frankly eye-watering sums of money available. Not at all. I fully expect that they are all true believers, and that it's just by a stroke of good fortune that they believe and research exactly the thing that governments are throwing money at right now. And that even without all this government money and the position of director at a policy centre inside an institution, inside a university that gets vast sums of government money, good old Bruce would still be 100% convinced that doubling down on renewables is the, quote, only, end quote, thing to do. Always be wary of the word only, by the way. It's one of the most powerful and potentially deceptive words in the English language. But let's go back to the article. The need to firm up the power grid as aging coal plants retire and hasten the rollout of renewables prompted Climate Change and Energy Minister Chris Bowen last year to significantly expand the government's capacity investment scheme and underwrite 32 gigawatts of renewable energy and storage. The taxpayer-backed intervention is needed to meet the country's objective of renewables supplying 82% of power by 2030. Did you see that? Renewables and the instability that they've brought to a previously stable grid are causing such a big problem that we need to spend more money on renewables and the associated transmission lines and batteries to try and fix the instability that wasn't there before we started building all of the renewables. So in a single article, we have renewables causing instability, which creates negative wholesale prices but simultaneously causes higher retail energy prices because of the inefficiencies and the costs that renewables impose elsewhere in the system. And the solution is to spend more on the thing that created the problem in the first place and then more again on batteries to try and stabilise the instability that we didn't used to have before we spent all that money on renewables. And this is what passes for journalism. This could have been a really good article, but Simon didn't take a step back and look at the bigger picture before he simply swallowed and repeated Bruce's opinion without questioning it first. As a result, this article ends up reading more like a propaganda puff piece than any sort of serious piece of journalism. This entire article, sadly, failed on the uncritical use of the word only. But most people, most of the time, would completely miss that and come away feeling like they're well-read, like they're educated, like they understand these issues because they read the news. When sadly all that's happened is that confirmation bias has been provided to prop up existing prejudices under the banner of journalism. The article continues, but sadly never provides any balance on this point. And for me, that makes it a worthy contender of our Article of the Week award. Now, that's not weak as in W-E-E-K or 7 days. It's weak as in W-E-A-K, lacking strength. In this case, lacking the strength and rigour and mental capacity required to properly cover the issue of energy prices and what's causing them to be sky high. So let me know in the comments if you'd like me to continue with more Articles of the Week episodes, breaking down these sorts of poor excuses for journalism around Australia and the world, and let me know whether you'd like it to be done like this as an editorial at the start of the Aussie Wire News, or if perhaps we should spin it off as a new weekly show demonstrating the worst examples of journalism that I can find. I'll be personally reading all your comments and I look forward to your feedback. In the meantime, here at last is the news. Well, you could be forgiven for thinking that the war in Ukraine is ancient history. The media certainly seem to have moved on, and there's another thing that we're supposed to be outraged these days, and no doubt there'll be another one in only another few weeks or months' time. But of course, for the people of Ukraine and for the soldiers that Russia has sent to the front lines, this is very much an ongoing concern. And concern is the word of the day, especially as things have developed the way that Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, has begun to become, well, I'm putting my words on this, increasingly authoritarian. There are some very, very dark shadows of history that seem to be extending themselves across Ukraine at the moment. My next guest is someone who's trying to raise the alarm on a very specific example of that, and that is Robert Amsterdam. He joins me now on the Aussie Wire. Robert, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Now, you're a man with tremendous personal experience in the legal world, fighting some very, very interesting legal battles from Russia itself through to Venezuela and many other places in between. What is the battle that you're now involved in fighting on behalf of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church?
Well, I'm privileged to act for the Holy Synod, and we are fighting a battle against a government that, in an absence of military victories, has decided that they will essentially claim the carcass of a 1,000-year-old church and mount it as some sort of trophy. And, our position is very simple. Number one, we absolutely support the people of Ukraine with respect to all of their desires to achieve whatever funding may be available. But we don't believe the church should be sacrificed as some sort of PR offering. Essentially, the Zelensky government is attempting to rid Ukraine of anything that has any historical connection to Russia. And because the church was at one point affiliated with the Russian Orthodox Church, from a canonical standpoint. Not, in fact, it has been independent since the early 90s, but they are using this as a way of attempting, firstly, through a bill to ban the church, secondly, to expropriate its assets and turn them over to a new state church that was founded 5 years ago, that is essentially a nationalist development, an autocephalous church, where the services are now more conducted in Ukrainian than Church Slavonic. And I, being a fairly old guy, recoil at this attempt by a secular power anywhere to interfere in the spiritual activity of their populace, especially in a manner this egregious, this unwarranted, this lacking in any form of evidential fiber. I mean, they are falsely accusing priests who are in their 70s of somehow having a pamphlet or something that supports Russia and then jailing them for 5 years. I mean, these are tactics I fought against in Putin's Russia, and I am fighting against in Zelensky's Ukraine. And simply because I support Ukraine does not mean that I shut my eyes and close my ears to the goings-on there. And the goings-on are not good. Zelensky's government now controls almost 80% of the economy. Rule of law is a joke. They're doing forcible conscription of members of our church. They are physically assaulting priests. It's a horror show, and it is backed up by a massive investment the Ukrainians have made in propaganda, which, by the way, is supported by Western press. You cannot break through in the media about this story. And hats off this morning to the British newspaper, The Telegraph, who I believe is the first major media to carry a story about this after this has been going on for months and months. So, you know, it is, I have come across this when I have gone to meet politicians. I've had staff interrupt me and basically shut down my ability to communicate because they appear either in the pay of or as some sort of disciples of the Ukrainian regime. And this narrow-minded incapacity of accepting criticism that I've found throughout my dealings with any member of the Ukrainian government just doesn't stand. I mean, to be honest, I've found African countries under autocratic rule to be more willing to listen to criticism than the Ukrainians.
Well, it's certainly a concern given that the war is now dragging on. It has become a meat grinder, and immense suffering is taking place every single day on those front lines. And yet, though, people fighting on those front lines are saying things like this. We have a clip here. This is a young Ukrainian soldier. I'll read the subtitles for those that are listening to the podcast. He's speaking in his native tongue, of course. This is what he had to say. People in military uniform should be here where I am at the front where there is a lack of people. Explain to me, how is it so? Tell me why we have only a couple of people at the front holding the line of defense. Whilst somewhere inside the rear, people in uniform are breaking churches, beating priests, beating the Ukrainian people, destroying churches. People in military uniform should be here where I am at the front. I mean, it's an extraordinary thing to imagine the suffering and the violence that man is witnessing and is involved in as someone who's a combatant in war. Whilst back at home in the city that he thought he was defending, he's watching the very thing that he thought he was defending be pulled apart. What is he talking about there with these churches being destroyed? Is that literal or is that metaphorical?
No, he's speaking literally. We have young kids being taken out of schools at 3 a.m. And bused to other locations. We have priests with broken jaws defending their churches. We have dozens of illegal arrests. We have forced conscription of believers. I mean, this is absolutely no joke. The people behind the new church appear to be violently predatory. And it's not a religious dispute because, in fact, many of the places they take over, they close. So it is, in part, it's ethnic. There is, I believe, a feeling that some of these churches are in areas where there's a stronger Russian minority. And it's also generational. Many of the members of the church that I'm representing are the more devout, more elderly, as I think we all can understand. As you get older and you get closer to your calling, you become more sensitive to regular attendance, if you will, increasing your chances of going up as opposed to down. And it's part of what's gotten me so incredibly driven about this. I'm a Jew, and the idea that I would go to synagogue one day and I would be told that I need to pray in English as opposed to Hebrew, and the rabbi's not the same guy as I'm used to. I mean, all of these things, I just find appalling.
Yeah.
And the fact that Christian leaders are saying nothing. The only guy who's spoken up is an American journalist named Tucker Carlson.
Yeah.
Who is wildly criticized, whose views I don't necessarily agree with, but more power to him. He had me on his show. We got 55 million views.
Yeah.
Now, why did we get so many views? Number one, a guy named Elon Musk retweeted it with the caption that said, "They're beating priests?" ?
Yeah.
And people are actually desperate for real information, and I think they understand we're in a moment. I would call it and compare it to a McCarthyite period, where information is not traveling. I was interviewed by the London Times 2 months ago. They wanted to find out who was funding us. They had no interest in the story, and they didn't publish it.
Yeah.
Because if you're not supporting, and even though I am supporting Ukraine, but if you're saying anything that's negative about Ukraine, they don't want to know where you're from. And to me, that's not journalism. And it's a very dangerous part of the war in Ukraine, that we are becoming so uneducated about what's going on. It's one of the things that I find appalling about the present day and the sanctioning process with respect to Russia and other countries, and I'm sure soon China, is that we are turning these countries into far greater enemies than they need to be.
Yeah.
And we are making them, we are dehumanizing them. We are shutting off our ability to talk to them. We're empowering autocrats like Putin by making sure that the people around him have to stay with him because they have no access to the West.
Yeah.
The Ukrainians have been the worst at sanctioning. They sanction everybody. And by sanctioning everybody, no one respects their sanctions list. So their sanctioning is for them, it's a replacement for rule of law. They simply have none anymore.
Yeah.
And the Zelensky government will be, in time exposed in terms of the corruption, in terms of the autocracy, in terms of their, for instance, this attack on the church is a PR instrument for their domestic consumption. There's no actual evidence that this church is aiding the Russians at all. And if it were, God forbid, the individuals who might be involved could be charged criminally.
Sure.
You don't ban a church. And in fact, in a week, we're coming out with a further white paper on how illegal and contrary to rule of law and EU standards this incredibly stupid bill is. This stupid bill is counterproductive.
Now,
It is against Ukraine's interests as well as rule of law.
I'm going to pause you there. You mentioned that you've got another white paper coming out, but we haven't yet mentioned that you have actually released a white paper already. And those that want to dive deeper into this and really begin to wrap their heads around what it is that we're supporting, and it's a shame that we have to put in these disclaimers, but it's necessary on the topic of Russia, Ukraine. I'm all in favour of Ukraine's right to self-defence. I certainly do not support Putin's attack on Ukraine. And there are a lot of people that have sort of been saying, oh, Putin's really the good guy in this. And I've always been pushing back and saying, I'm not so sure that there is a good guy in this particular war. That's where I stand on this particular issue. But one thing that should concern us is that our tax money and our materiel and our international standing and reputation and our list of friends and our list of enemies are all now being wrapped up in this particular conflict. And if you want to understand what's really going on, the Freedom of Religion Under Attack in Ukraine white paper that you've released at savetheuoc.com is where people can download that and find that. Now, what's the way forward for you? You've already mentioned that the rule of law in Ukraine is broken. Surely you're not expecting to be able to win within Ukraine. So where is this legal battle being fought?
Well, look, it is being fought through a lobbying campaign. It is going to be fought in the courts because, as we've demonstrated in this new white paper, everything the Ukrainians are doing is contrary to the European Court of Human Rights, the basic tenets of human rights law there. This act is disproportionate. It's got really no grounding factually. I mean, again, it's a stopgap measure. Sadly, for the Ukrainians, the counteroffensive was not a success, and they believe that somehow really harassing and intimidating their fellow citizens during a time of war is the go-to thing to do. And I just, as I said, you can't. This could not be done at a more difficult time for Ukraine. It will impact them negatively with American legislators. It's just a foolish thing to do, and it's solely for domestic consumption. It's solely so he can keep the votes in support of the ultra-right-wing super nationalists. And I denounce them for this blatantly political chicanery that more belongs in the New York of the 19th century Tammany Hall than it should in a democratic society.
Yeah. Well, Robert Amsterdam, thank you so much for your time. I wish strength to your arm as you fight this particular fight on behalf of religious freedom. Religious freedom is something that affects us all, whether we are actually individually religious or not. The principles, when they are lost for absolutely everyone. So thank you so much for what you're doing. We'll stay across this story and bring updates to our viewers here at the Aussie Wire as they come to hand. Robert Amsterdam, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, sir.
Well, I've made no secret of it here on the Aussie Wire that I'm thrilled to see that Javier Milei, the newly inaugurated Argentinian president, was indeed the winner of their last election. He came into that election promising some very, very big changes, the like of which we really haven't seen in any country in my lifetime. So I was very, very excited and very curious to see, A, whether he was going to be able to actually pull off any of those changes, and B, whether they were going to have the effect that I believe, and he clearly believes they would have, which would be a very, very positive effect. Well, of course, there is no substitute for reality. We can have all the ideas we want, but we need to have a look at what's going on in reality and measure what we believe based on how well it actually works. And Javier Milei gives us a wonderful opportunity to do exactly that. Well, someone who is no stranger to the Aussie Wire was actually there at the inauguration, took the time to travel across, and that is none other than the Honourable John Ruddick MLC, and he joins us right now on the Aussie Wire. John, thank you so much.
Great to see you, Topher. Happy New Year.
And to you too. Now, you actually took the time to travel across to Argentina. Now, you are a Libertarian MP, and Javier Milei is a completely unrelated Libertarian party, of course. There's no relationship between the parties, but obviously there's a relationship in terms of the worldviews and the outlooks. What was it that made you decide you wanted to actually be there in person?
Well, look, I've been sort of following Javier Milei for about a year. Okay, when he was this long shot candidate for president. He'd only got into Congress, I think, two or 4 years ago, but prior to that, he'd been an academic, made a lot of YouTube videos about radical libertarianism. So I thought, look, this guy's fantastic. So look, we were very excited. Libertarians all around the world were very, very excited when he got elected. I was one of about 300 international guests that they kindly invited to go over to be part of the inauguration, the official ceremonies. Met a lot of other people, basically from mainly from Latin America. Look, the key thing I'd like to say on my return, Topher, is this. Buenos Aires, their capital city, you walk around the place, it is very, very clear this was once a very wealthy country. I would say more so than Sydney or Melbourne, okay?
Yeah, right.
The architecture, I mean, I've read in the paper and in books that in the 1940s, Argentina was the wealthiest country on earth. I now believe it, okay? The streets are beautiful boulevards. The architecture is twice as grand as the best thing in Collins Street or Martin Place in Sydney, okay? But look, that was a long time ago. And somebody asked me when I came back, said, John, what's it like? I said, look, I'll tell you what Argentina's like. Imagine if Gough Whitlam ran Australia, not for 3 years, but for 60 years. 60 years of Gough Whitlamism. That is basic. Look, they say that they were socialists over there in Argentina. Look, they weren't communists, okay? They were democratic socialists. They did keep having elections. Well, there were a few dictatorships, okay? Not for long, not for long.
Yeah.
It's basically been a democracy. And the people have basically voted for a very big government, okay? And now the place which was booming in the it was booming for 100 years before the 1940s, okay? Because they basically had a government which was consciously, we want to be a really, really small government, and we want to let in foreign investment, and we want to let in ambitious migrants, and the place was magnificent. And now it's gone to hell. The place is in decay. So I'm looking at it now, and I'm thinking, look, Javier Milei, who we all love on the Aussie Wire, he's got one hell of a job, Topher. But if anyone on the earth can turn it around, it is Javier Milei.
Well, I'll tell you what, everything that you're saying resonates with me very strongly after the week that I spent in Caracas, of course, Venezuela. I was there in 2015 with my wife, and we noticed the exact same thing. It was striking how obvious it was that they had money, and also simultaneously the amount of decay and misery that we were surrounded by. And the juxtaposition becomes really quite painful to actually watch. There's this beautiful architecture, and then there's a line of people hoping to get butter from the supermarket today. We're hoping we'll be able to afford the butter when we get in there and find out what the price is. It's just absolute madness. Coming to Javier Milei, though, he came into the presidency having made some pretty big claims about what it was that he was going to do. The proof is always in the pudding. We've seen election after election where someone gets elected and then fails to even try and deliver on the things that they've promised. How would you score Javier Milei so far? It's very early days, but nevertheless, how has he gotten started?
Look, he gets a 10 out of 10 from me so far, Topher. Now, you remember about a year and a half ago, we had a British Prime Minister, Liz Truss, for about sort of 3 or 4 weeks. She came in on an agenda. She was elected by the Conservative membership. She came in on an agenda of bringing about some sort of Thatcherite-style economic reforms. She tried. There was pushback. She collapsed. Yeah. Okay. Now Milei is not Liz Truss. Milei is absolutely an ideologue who happens to be a politician.
Right.
He is not a politician who's got a few ideas.
Yeah.
So he is going full steam ahead. He's doing magnificent things, and he's only got about 20% of the Congress.
Yeah.
But the thing is, it's not as bad as it sounds, because look, he won 56% of the popular vote. That is a landslide in anybody's book. So that gives him a lot of political capital. And those people in Congress, they all want to get re-elected because they are politicians, right? If they go against this very popular president, it's going to hurt them. So I think he will have I think he'll have more cooperation from the Congress than we expect. But then in 2 years' time, there's new congressional elections.
Yeah.
So this is the major challenge, Topher. You know, when Reagan and Thatcher, and they were very mild little pussycats compared to Milei, okay?
Yeah.
But they were great figures. When Reagan and Thatcher first got elected, they brought in some very good economic reforms, not as good as Milei, but very good. And both the US and the UK went into a 2-year nasty little recession.
Yeah.
Okay. And Reagan and Thatcher's polling was pretty bad after about 18 months.
Yeah.
Okay. But what they were doing is they were giving a sick patient, the economy, tough medicine. Okay. And that recession was good. Okay. It meant that the US and the UK could then rebound with strength. They got inflation under control, et cetera, et cetera. And then basically the US and the UK had 30 good years after that. Thank you, Reagan and Thatcher.
Yeah.
But the key thing is a 2-year recession when you've got a sick patient. Now, Argentina's more sick than the US and the UK ever were.
Yeah.
And he's now bringing this tough minute. So this is my prediction, Topher. For the next 18 months, 2 years, the economic indicators in Argentina are going to go down. There will probably be increased unemployment. There will probably be increased, other bad things, okay? But the inflation will come down. That's the thing they've got to kill. That's what he's working on. So, yes, he gets a 10 out of 10 from me so far.
Well, he certainly gets an A for effort from me. I don't necessarily share your optimism regarding cooperation from the Congress. That is, of course, a challenge in anyone that has that kind of presidential style of government. The president can say what he likes. He's got the bully pulpit there. But if he doesn't have the numbers in Congress, which, unlike our system, where if you're the prime minister, inherently you do have the numbers, at least in the lower house, in their system, you can have 20% of Congress and still be the president if you happen to win the popular vote. That's the situation he finds himself in. I want to get to some specific policies that he has been working on. Whether they're successful or not remains to be seen. This particular one here was reported on by Joey Manorino in the US. Now, this is something that I find quite interesting here. It's almost a bit petty. There's an element of me that feels like this is a bit petty and yet also very significant at the same time. What he's done here, John, is he's actually made a rule that says that government departments cannot use the word free in reference to anything that is taxpayer funded. Now, this ruffled some feathers. There was some of my haters were quite upset about my support for this, saying, I thought you were all in favour of free speech. What are your thoughts on this? Is this something we could possibly learn from and copy here?
I absolutely love it. This is one of the things Milei has done, which since he got inaugurated, which I think is one of the best things. Now, you are right that at face value, it looks like a little petty, little semantics thing, okay, just changing a word. But it just shows us how much of an ideologue, how much of a true believer Milei is. He's told the public service in Argentina, look, you cannot use the word free for services. And it's brilliant. It just shows you how much he really wants to change the culture of the Argentinian people. So what he's saying is, look, you might get something, it's free for you, but somebody else has paid for it.
Yeah.
And I think this is just magnificent. This shows you why he's on track to be a more significant figure than Reagan and Thatcher, because he's getting down into the nitty-gritty. He wants to change how people think. And look, the poor old Argentinian people, I can tell you, look, they walk around the streets. I was right in the guts of Buenos Aires, right in the heart of the political district and the business district, okay? I can tell you the people walk around. I've got to say, Topher, and I'm sorry to say this, there is a bit of sort of dejection about them, okay? It almost reminded me when I went to Eastern Europe in or East Germany in about a decade after the Berlin Wall came down. I thought, look, these people are still, socialism really sort of takes the spirit out of people.
Yeah.
So I love what Milei has done, saying to government departments, no, you cannot refer to government programs as free stuff for people. I love it, Topher.
Well, it's interesting because in the private sector, if I were to advertise something as free and sort of be manipulating language in that way, I'd be liable to end up for violations of various trade practices acts and so forth for having sort of misrepresented my product or how it gets paid for. So I find it interesting, and to me, I see it more as bringing the government into line with the public sector. The other big thing that we've seen come out is a 350 different program cut to various socialist kind of programs within Argentina. It's quite astonishing to think that there are 350 in the first place. But if we took a step back, there'd have to be at least that many or more just here in Australia, wouldn't there?
Oh, there would be. Now, you remember we had the Liberal Party came to power in 2013 in this country, and they made a big song and dance about how they were going to get rid of regulations that are holding back the economy. And Josh Frydenberg I think he was the Minister for Deregulation. Now they put on press conferences and they did a few little stunts about, we're getting rid of all this, we're getting it.
Yeah.
Okay, but they went through all the statute books and they just found a ton of old regulations that have just become redundant. No one pays it. Might have been some banana importation statute from 1942, okay? And they just thought, look, it's completely superfluous now, so we'll say we're getting rid of it. It was all garbage, okay? Because, in fact, that government brought in more regulations than any other government in history, okay? The financial services, and your wife would know about that, in everything else, okay, they brought in a ton of regulation. Now, Malay's here... And yes, he's used his executive order. It's very similar to the US presidency, the Argentinian presidency. So they do have a bit of executive power. Congress has got the guts of the power. But yes, he's gone through and he's identified 350 programs that he can just say, no, sorry, we're not doing it anymore. Now, this is shock therapy, okay? People are going to get upset about it. there are already protests in the streets. But the great thing about Javier Milei is, being an ideologue and not a politician, is he cares about his ideas being implemented, and he doesn't really think that much about getting re-elected.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
What a beautiful man.
Yeah. Well, look, when someone like that comes to power and pushes things in the right direction, it's great. But we would decry exactly the same thing about someone who was perhaps coming in with very strongly socialist or communistic ideas. We would decry the ideologue in them under those circumstances. So I have some caution about me there. But I do agree with this particular cut of 350 different programs, because it is coming from essentially an executive order. It is essentially it's within his wheelhouse to be able to do that. And so he is. We continue the coverage here. Argentina's newly elected president has signed a necessity and urgency decree and basically just said this is such an emergency. Coming back to what you were saying earlier there, John, this is such an emergency. This is such a dire situation that we have to take the tough medicine. Do you think the popular support for him will hold? Has he prepared people enough for that shock therapy?
Okay, well, that is the critical question. Okay, no doubt about it, because there have been other Latin American leaders in the last sort of 20, 30 years who have tried with what we might call Milton Friedmanism, and they've sort of backed away from it. Okay, that has happened now. He's got 56% of the vote. That's great. Now, what he's also got is that he is an extremely charismatic figure, putting aside his politics, with the chainsaw and the beautiful women and the crazy hair, okay, and just the theatrics, okay. He's extremely charismatic. So this is this is what it all comes down to. They've got congressional elections in 2 years' time. Milei's got his party now, like the Libertarian Party or something. Sure. Okay, now he's going to bring in the tough tasting medicine. He's already doing it. He's not mucking around. So in 2 years' time, when we have the congressional elections in Argentina, is Milei's party going to have a surge in support? Or are the Argentinian people going to say, oh, Mr. Milei, we liked you, but we don't like your policies. My life's become more unhappy since you got elected. Yeah. That's the critical moment in 2 years' time, the congressional elections. If anyone can hold it together, okay, I think it is Milei because of the force of his personality. Okay, but that is not a certainty. He might have a swing against him in 2 years' time. Yeah. Okay, well then,
yeah, we'll have to wait. Be good. Yeah, we'll have to wait and see. And I do hope that he maintains support, because I do hope to see that some of these ideas making their way across the ocean to Australia. Last question for you, John, before I let you go. Donald Trump must be looking at this with some interest. There have been some interactions on Twitter. He's congratulated Milei on Twitter. We know that he's at the very least aware of Milei and aware of where he stands on so many issues. Would Donald Trump be looking at this, do you think, wondering what might have happened if he'd gone harder about cutting down the alphabet agencies and delivering on some of the things that he said he was going to do prior to the presidency, but then he was yet another in a long list of people who kind of came in a lot more softly than what the rhetoric would have suggested?
Well, there's no doubt that Trump did underperform when he talked about draining the swamp. The truth is, he was a businessman who had barely ever been to Washington, D.C. in his life. Yeah. Now, he gets elected. He was new to Washington, and he basically had the GOP establishment choose. The president gets to appoint about 300 people, not just his staff, but and in very important positions. And he basically just sort of went along with what the GOP establishment said. Oh, you should appoint this person, you should appoint this person. Now, 80% of the appointments turned out to be snakes trying to undermine him. Yeah. Now, so I'm pro-Trump. Okay, I like Trump a lot. Okay, Trump is more than Trump. Trump's now a symbol of the resistance to wokeism, in my view. Okay, so, but look, Trump is not a libertarian. Okay, no. So he doesn't have libertarian instincts. Trump thinks left-wing governments are bad. So how do we counter that? We have a big, powerful right-wing government. Okay, so now I hope he gets re-elected, Mr. Trump. But look, Mr. Trump's got to learn from Mr. Milei, okay, about how to really turn things around. And so they do like each other, and they have had Milei has said for months that he's pro-Trump, okay. Now, I think he's pro-Trump Trump's policies were in the right direction. He cut company tax from 35 to about 20%, which was fantastic, which made the American economy boom, particularly for low-income earners, because they got jobs. But look, they like each other, but I think they sort of like each other because they were both sort of, battling the same evil empire.
They're both outsiders.
I think, they're outsiders, that they like each other. They're highly charismatic. I can't wait till this will be if Trump and Milei, if Trump can get re-elected, Trump and Milei can have a summit. Now, that'll be one to keep an eye on, Topher.
Well, you mentioned that Trump needs to learn from Milei. I'd suggest that Trump probably needs to learn from Trump and learn a few lessons from that first 4 years, and perhaps 4 years on the bench may prove to be the best thing that could have happened once it all comes out in the wash and we see how history unfolds. Well, John Ruddick, thank you so much. You're a friend of the show. We do appreciate you coming on, giving us your thoughts. And as we keep an eye on world events, we'll continue to follow the developments in Argentina as and when they happen. Thank you so much for joining us.
Terrific. Thanks for having us, Topher.
Well, here at the Aussie Wire, we are expanding and growing as quickly as we reasonably can, and we're incredibly excited right here on the first live episode of 2024 to be introducing our North American correspondent. This is someone that I met at ARC. She absolutely blew away the entire team, the leadership team, as well as the rest of the team that work with us. We reached out to her and were thrilled when she said, hey, yes, I'll be your North America correspondent, and bring some of the madness, the craziness. The North Americans, honestly, in the last couple of years, I feel like they've lost their minds. I hope the one we're about to talk to has managed to keep her sanity and is going to keep us apprised of everything that goes on. It is Julie Hartman. Julie, welcome to the Aussie Wire, and thank you so much for coming on.
Topher, thank you so much for having me. I'm so honored to be joining you in this position. And I promise you, I'm one of the few sane ones here in North America. But hey, there are a few insane people down under too.
Look, no argument from me, but I've got to say that combination of Justin Trudeau and Joe Biden just seems to be a bit of a special leadership group you've got up there. What in the world, what are they putting in the water? Is this just Flint, Michigan water is getting everywhere else now as well?
Who the heck knows? I mean, there's all this stuff coming across our border as we're talking about. Maybe they're infecting the water with some crazy stuff. I would love to blame it on that. This craziness is a homegrown ideology, sadly.
Yeah, that's the problem. And same with my former home state of Victoria. The problem is us. Look, let's dive into some of this news out of North America that you've kindly brought to our attention. Look, I've got to be honest, I found it a little bit hard to get excited about this story at first when it broke a couple of weeks ago. And yet the more I dove into it and the more you explained to me, the more I went, hang on, this is quite strange here. For those that don't know what's going on, this is Claudine Gay. She was the president of Harvard. She has been sort of forced to resign. But it's weird, it's messy. Bring us up to speed for anyone that doesn't know what's going on here.
Yes, I should also add, as I'm analyzing this story, I graduated from Harvard about a year and a half ago. I'm the class of 2022. So I have a special connection to this story. But yes, for those who are unaware, Claudine Gay was made the 30th president of Harvard on September 29th, 2023. I think she was formally brought in as the president sometime in the summer, but her inauguration date was September 29th. Now, that is 8 days before the October 7th terrorist attack in Israel. So I hope that Miss Gay enjoyed those 8 days of being the president of Harvard, because that was the only time of calm for her. Once the October 7th atrocities happened, it was all downhill there for her as all hell broke loose on Harvard's campus and on other college campuses all around the country. I'm sure you have seen videos of students chanting Intifada, globalize the Intifada. Sadly, on Harvard's campus, there were some students holding Hamas flags. There were videos of students intimidating their Jewish classmates, blocking them from going to class. And Harvard barely said anything about it. It took them a few days to release a statement about October 7th. Many deemed it to be mealy-mouthed and too little, too late. And on top of that, just a few days after the October 7th massacre, 34 student organizations at Harvard signed a petition in which they said that the Israeli, quote, regime is entirely responsible for the terrorist attack that happened by Hamas against them. So that was kind of the first part of the story where Harvard, and specifically President Claudine Gay, was not seen as being vociferous enough in her condemnation of this anti-Semitism on campus. Then what came next was all of these allegations of plagiarism that Miss Gay had apparently improperly cited the work of many, many different scholars, including one scholar, Dr. Carol Swain, who I actually interviewed on my show. And then I think the third kind of and final nail in the coffin were those congressional hearings when the presidents of Harvard, MIT, and Penn went to United States Congress to explain the surge of anti-Semitism on their campus. And that's when we saw the viral video of Miss Gay saying, well, calling for the genocide of Jews on our campus depends on the context. Yeah. And then, of course, she was forced to resign.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary thing. And I can't help but feel like these universities are beginning to get a taste of their own medicine. They, of course, have been a breeding ground for a lot of these sorts of ideas over the years, and many people have been harmed by the sorts of ideas that they've allowed to grow, whether it comes down to socially progressive ideas such as transgenderism and critical race theory and these sorts of things. Now it seems like these things are turning on they're biting the hand that fed them. You mentioned there the issue of the plagiarism. This has been called a conservative attack on Claudine Gay. Is there real substance to these allegations of plagiarism? And why should we care? Why did this become international news? Why are we halfway around the world talking about it now? Why is this such a big story?
Well, it is such a big story because Harvard is seen as the top university, not just in the United States, but all around the world. I mean, that name has such recognition. That's why I wanted to go to that school, because I wanted all of the opportunities, and I will admit the prestige of the name that came with it. And now that name is being tarnished. And I think it's kind of a fascinating thing to people, because they look and they go, oh, an institution like Harvard would never elevate someone to become the president who plagiarized. And these are not just one or two accusations of plagiarism. These are a dozen. Some are even saying several dozen accusations of plagiarism. So I think it's a fascinating spectacle, and it indicates that many of these once esteemed institutions, and I'm not just talking about universities and colleges, I'm talking about businesses, I'm talking about departments here in our government. These once esteemed institutions have been infected by the diversity, equity, and inclusion rot, and now they are no longer carrying the kind of pedigree that they once enjoyed. So I think it's indicative of a broader problem that people are starting to catch on to.
One of the things I love about American politics is that it seems to spawn and generate a particularly high class of meme. I'm a big fan of meme wars. I follow a lot of meme pages. I saw this one come out with regard to the Claudine Gay saga, plagiarism accusations, of course, the 3 keys to success. And in case you're watching on your phone and you can't see what those keys are, it is Control-C, Control-V, Control-Copy, Control-Paste by Claudine Gay. I do appreciate that about Americans and your politics. Now, you brought this to my attention. This was Claudine Gay's attempt to smooth everything over, to make it okay. And it went just about as well as that congressional hearing you mentioned a moment ago.
Oh my gosh, this New York Times article was so, it was both shocking and not shocking, really. So here's what happened. So Miss Gay resigned officially on January 2nd. And in the email that she sent to the Harvard community, I, as an alum, received that email. She said, basically, out of my love for Harvard, I'm going to resign because in this moment of turmoil, I want the focus to be on the institution as opposed to an individual. Sure. And so then, you read that first paragraph and you go, okay, well, she's going to take responsibility for, not condemning quickly enough the 37 student organizations, that despicable letter. She's going to take responsibility for the congressional hearing. She's going to take responsibility for the plagiarism that she engaged in. And no, she didn't take any responsibility in that email. The Harvard Corporation followed up with a second email in which they said, yes, Miss Gay has made some mishaps. That was their word, mishaps. But, she's been a wonderful leader. And so then when we all saw this New York Times piece, we go, okay, is she going to finally take responsibility? And no, she doubled down. Let's look, if you don't mind, at the first part of that New York Times piece. So here she is announcing, giving background to everyone. And by the way, the title of the piece is "What Happened at Harvard is Bigger Than Me." Okay. So she's basically saying that what happened to her is part of a greater campaign. So she starts off here with talking about accusations of racism and racist threats that have been hurled towards her. My inbox has been flooded with invective, including death threats. I've been called the N-word more times than I care to count. Okay, look, if that happened to her, I will be the first one to say that is despicable.
Yeah, it's not okay.
But of course, but it just seems a little bit not the point. And it seems a little bit like she might be throwing out these accusations of racism to distract from the greater scandal, which is really the fact that she plagiarized and she did not, handle the anti-Semitism correctly. So then she goes on and she says that demagogues are seizing on an opportunity to weaponize her presidency. I'm reading from here. I have to quote Topher lest I fall into the Claudine Gay trap. I'm quoting. Yes, to further weaponize my presidency in their campaign to undermine the ideals animating Harvard since its founding. Okay. She goes on to say that there is, quote, a broader war to unravel public faith in pillars of American society. So you can kind of get the undertone here, right? She's saying essentially, and again, I want to make it clear, that what I'm about to say, these are not her exact words. This is what I am judging to be the undertone. What I'm judging to be the undertone is I'm a Black woman. These racist demagogues in this society hate people like me, and they are launching an all-out campaign to knock me off of my perch because I'm a Black woman.
Yeah.
And then she continues and she starts talking about the October 7th atrocity and the aftermath at Harvard. She says, yes, I made mistakes. In my initial response to the atrocities of October 7th, I should have stated more forcefully what all people of good conscience know. And then she says, Hamas is a terrorist organization and that she wants to protect Jewish students. But then she says, I neglected to clearly articulate, at a congressional hearing last month, I fell into a well-laid trap. Ms. Gay, that was not a well-laid trap. Congresswoman Stefanik, who was the one questioning, gave her and the other college presidents several opportunities to clarify their position. You heard Congresswoman Stefanik, Representative Stefanik. She said, I'm going to ask one more time. I'm going to give you one more opportunity.
Yeah.
Does calling for the genocide of Jews on your campus violate your bullying and harassment codes? This was not a trap.
Yeah.
Claudine Gay made a mistake here. And then the final thing I will show you, just to further illustrate how there is no responsibility for her actions. She goes on to address the allegations of plagiarism. And the word she uses is that she duplicated other scholars' language. And so the final point I'll make here is that if Claudine Gay had taken full responsibility for her actions, starting with that student organization, the letter signed by the student organization, then with the congressional hearings, then with the plagiarism, if she had resigned gracefully in taking responsibility, I think that all of us would have some respect for her.
Sure.
But she is doubling down. She is refusing to take responsibility. And that is showing why she should have never been the president of Harvard, because a kind of person that doesn't take responsibility for their mistakes is not a leader.
It's an extraordinary thing. And the bigger issue here from my perspective is not actually Claudine Gay. There's a truism. It's one of those things that's been used so many times that it's almost useless. And yet it is still true that the revolution always eats its own. And in so many cases, the revolution has taken place on university campuses. And I find it fascinating now that increasingly around the world, Claudine Gay just being one example of many, the actions of their own students are now beginning to eat the faculty that made those students possible. We're beginning to watch this revolution, this cultural revolution on universities begin to eat their own. And for me, that's always a sign that change is coming, and hopefully change for the better. But of course, there is no guarantee about that. Well, Julie, we had some other stories lined up for today, but that's actually all we've got time for this particular episode. So we're going to have to get you back on very, very shortly to continue to wrap our minds around some of the madness that's going on in the US, why it matters and how it potentially affects us here in Australia. But of course, we have viewers all around the world as well. Julie Hartman, before I let you go, how can people find you if they want to find your work that's not on the Aussie Wire? Where would they look?
They would go to the Julie Hartman YouTube channel. They can catch there my show, Timeless with Julie Hartman, as well as my show with Dennis Prager called Dennis and Julie. And you can also follow me on Instagram and X at Julie R. Hartman. Thank you so much, Topher. It's been great to analyze these news stories with you, if not a little depressing.
It can be sometimes, but hey, we've got to keep across what's happening. And you know what? I think there's a lot of hope for the future. I'm actually a very optimistic person. I know from talking to you that you are too. And I think we've got a great future ahead of us, just with some speed bumps between now and then. Yes. For now, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching the Aussie Wire News. We release new episodes of the Aussie Wire News every Tuesday and Thursday at 4 p.m. You can catch up on past episodes and all of our blogs at theaussiewire.com, and you can follow us on all our socials via @theaussiewire. And remember to become an insider, that's a financial supporter, via the link in the description. I'm Topher Field, and this is the Aussie Wire.